40 years. That is how long it took one woman to build something that the broadcasting industry said was impossible. Not inherited. Not handed to her. Built from a single television station in Dallas, Texas, into a signal reaching more than 100 million homes and spanning more than 200 countries. Joni Lamb did not enter American homes as entertainment. She entered as a presence. A voice that was still there at 3 in the morning when every other channel had gone dark and the silence of an empty house had become too heavy to carry alone. Her audience was not casual. They were committed. Millions of them, many elderly, many living alone, who did not simply watch Daystar television network. They funded it. They wrote letters in longhand on notebook paper. They stretched fixed incomes during pledge drives because they believed, genuinely and completely, that what they were supporting was something real. When Joni Lamb died in May of 2026, suddenly and without explanation, they expected to grieve together. What they got instead ignited one of the most intense controversies American evangelical Christianity has witnessed in years. How did that happen, and why did it cut so deeply into so many lives? To answer that question honestly, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what Joni Lamb built, and more than that, you have to understand who she was before the cameras found her, before the network existed, before the name Daystar meant anything to anyone. Because this was not a woman who was given power. She earned it brick by brick, prayer by prayer, decade by decade, in the way that only people who start with very little ever truly learn to build. Joni Lamb was born Joni Davis in 1960 in a small town in South Carolina. She grew up in a household of modest means and deep, unperformative faith. The kind of faith that does not announce itself on Sunday mornings and disappear by Monday afternoon. The kind that shapes how a family eats dinner together. How they speak to strangers. How they absorb hardship without letting it hollow them out. Church was not an obligation in the Davis household. It was the framework through which everything else was understood. From an early age, Joni felt something pulling her toward a purpose she could not yet name. Not ambition in the conventional sense, not a desire for recognition or influence, but something quieter and more persistent than either of those things. She described it in interviews throughout her life as a calling she could not silence. A sense that she was meant to reach people, to speak to something in them that ordinary life did not always address. She carried that sense with her into adulthood, not knowing yet what form it would take. What finally gave it form, and what happened when that form met the real world? The answer arrived in the 1980s in the person of Marcus Lamb. Marcus was a young broadcaster with a vision that most reasonable people would have dismissed outright. He wanted to build a Christian television network, not a local access channel. Not a regional station with modest reach and modest ambitions. A national network. One that would carry the message of faith into homes across America, every demographic, every time zone, every living room where someone was sitting alone at midnight wondering if anyone was listening. The television industry of the 1980s was not a forgiving environment for that kind of idealism. The infrastructure required was enormous. The financial barriers were real. The skeptics were plentiful and not entirely wrong in their skepticism. Marcus saw past all of it, and so did Joni. They married in 1987, and from that day forward they functioned not as a minister and his supportive spouse but as genuine co-founders, equal in vision, equal in commitment, equal in the daily, unglamorous, relentless work of turning an impossible idea into something that actually existed in the world. That distinction mattered enormously, both to the people who worked alongside them and to the audience that eventually found them. Joni was never background. She was never decorative. She was a builder, and everyone inside Daystar understood that from the beginning. They launched Daystar Television Network in 1997. What began as a single station in Dallas grew with a speed that surprised even the people driving it. Within a decade, Daystar had become the second largest Christian television network in the United States. The reach extended to more than 100 million homes domestically, and the international signal carried across more than 200 countries, broadcasting sermons, worship music, teaching, testimony, and prayer coverage around the clock, every day of the year. But scale was never what Joni spoke about when she described what the network meant to her. What she spoke about were the letters. So what exactly was in those letters? And what did they reveal about the audience Joni had built? Thousands of letters arrived from viewers who wrote in longhand on notebook paper or typed carefully on computers they had only recently learned to use. They described moments when they had turned on Daystar in the middle of a sleepless night, grieving, frightened, lost, and found something that held them together until morning. A widow in rural Ohio who said the network was the only voice in her house after her husband of 50 years had died. A man in his 70s in rural Mississippi who had stopped leaving his home but still felt connected to something larger through the screen in his living room. A mother in California who said she had found her way back to faith through a conversation she had watched on Joni's program. Not a sermon, not a performance, just an honest conversation between people willing to speak about the parts of life that polished religious broadcasting usually avoided. Those letters were the metric Joni returned to constantly. Not the ratings. Not the donor numbers. The letters. Her own program, Joni Table Talk, ran for years and became one of the most distinctive offerings in Christian broadcasting. The format was deceptively simple. A round table. A host. Guests from ministry, from entertainment, from ordinary life. Conversation that moved wherever it needed to move. What made it work? What made it genuinely different from the dozens of similar programs that populated Christian television? Was Joni's willingness to go where other hosts would not. She asked about doubt. About failure. About the specific ways in which faith gets tested by real life and does not always emerge from the test looking the way you expected it to. She was not interested in performing certainty she did not feel. Her audience recognized that instantly and rewarded it with a loyalty that lasted decades. Then came November of 2021. Marcus Lamb died of complications from COVID-19. He was 64 years old. For the Daystar audience, it was a moment of collective grief that the network's own programming had to carry in real time. Joni did not retreat from that grief. She stepped forward publicly and deliberately, assumed full leadership of everything Marcus had built alongside her, and kept broadcasting. Those who worked with her during that period described a woman carrying an enormous weight who refused to let it crush the mission. She spoke openly on air about loneliness, about the particular silence of a house that had always held two voices, about what it meant to continue a calling when the person you had built it with was no longer there. Her audience did not drift away. They drew closer. Because she was doing what she had always done. She was being honest. She was showing up. And she was trusting that the people watching were capable of handling truth. Would that trust hold after her own death, when others would make decisions in her name? For 4 more years after Marcus died, Joni Lamb led Daystar alone. Then in May of 2026, she was gone. 65 years old. No explanation offered. No clarity extended to the audience that had trusted her with so much for so long. Just silence. And then something that turned that silence into something far more difficult to bear. Grief for a community of faith follows a certain rhythm. There is shock, then mourning, then the slow and painful process of gathering together, in person, in prayer, in shared memory, to honor the one who is gone. That rhythm is sacred. For the millions who loved Joni Lamb, they expected it to be honored. They expected a farewell that reflected what she had stood for, what she had built, what she had sacrificed. They expected at minimum to be considered. They were not. The announcement came without fanfare, quietly, almost procedurally, as if the decision was self-evident and required no explanation. Joni Lamb's memorial service would be held in association with Gateway Church, one of the largest megachurches in the state of Texas, headquartered in Southlake, a wealthy suburb situated between Dallas and Fort Worth. On paper, the connection made a certain kind of institutional sense. Gateway was large, well-resourced, and geographically close to Daystar's base of operations. It had the infrastructure, the auditorium capacity, and the broadcast capability to handle a service of significant scale. But the people who received that announcement were not reading it on paper in a vacuum. They were reading it as members of a faith community that had been paying close attention to American evangelical Christianity for years. And within that community, the name Gateway Church no longer carried the neutrality it once might have. Why? Because of what had happened there in the summer of 2024, and because of a name that was now impossible to separate from it. What had happened at Gateway, and why did it matter so profoundly to Daystar's audience? In the summer of 2024, a woman named Cindy Clearlisa stepped forward publicly, deliberately, and with the kind of specificity that made her account impossible to dismiss. She alleged that Robert Morris, the founder and senior pastor of Gateway Church, one of the most celebrated figures in American evangelical Christianity, author of more than a dozen widely read books on faith and financial stewardship, had sexually abused her beginning when she was 12 years old. Morris, according to her account, had entered her family's life as a trusted figure, a spiritual mentor, a family friend whose presence carried the authority and the safety that the word pastor is supposed to guarantee. The abuse she described was not ambiguous. It was the deliberate, repeated sexual abuse of a minor by a man in a position of absolute spiritual authority over her family. She had carried that weight for decades. When she finally spoke, the evangelical world listened. She was not alone. In the weeks following her public statement, additional voices emerged. Women with their own accounts, their own memories, their own decades of silence finally given permission to break. The pattern across these accounts was not the portrait of isolated incidents or individual failures of judgment. It was the portrait of a man who had used the structures of ministry, the access granted by pastoral relationships, the deference extended to spiritual authority, and the silence enforced by institutional protection to abuse over an extended period of time. Journalists and investigators began examining the institutional record. Questions arose not only about Morris's conduct, but about what the leadership around him had known, and when they had known it, and what choices had been made in response to that knowledge. Those questions did not produce clean answers. They produced a picture of an institution that had for years prioritized its own continuity and reputation over the safety of the people it claimed to serve. Robert Morris did not fight the allegations publicly. In June of 2024, he resigned from Gateway Church. The resignation statement he issued acknowledged, in language chosen with visible precision, that he had behaved in ways that were, in his own words, inappropriate with a young lady. Not a child. Not a 12-year-old girl. Not a minor placed in his care by a family who trusted him with something sacred and irreplaceable. A young lady. The reaction to that language was immediate and fierce. Survivors, advocates, abuse prevention organizations, and ordinary believers across the theological spectrum identified instantly what the phrasing was designed to accomplish. It failed on the moral level entirely because the documented facts were not ambiguous. Law enforcement became involved. Investigations were opened. The story did not fade. It became, in the words of multiple observers across the evangelical press, the defining moral crisis of American megachurch Christianity in the decade. So what did it mean when the decision was made to connect Joni Lamb's memorial to the institution still carrying that history? Gateway Church continued to operate after Morris's resignation. The leadership that remained made public statements expressing sorrow, commitment to accountability, and dedication to the healing of those who had been harmed. They announced internal reviews. They used the language of institutional repentance. But they did not change the name. They continued as Gateway Church, carrying that name and everything now permanently attached to it forward into whatever came next. That choice was theirs to make. And one of the consequences of that choice arrived in May of 2026, when the decision was made to hold Joni Lamb's memorial in association with an institution still defined, in the public consciousness of the evangelical world, by the most serious moral failure imaginable. The association was not neutral. It was not merely logistical. It was a statement, whether intended as one or not. The response from Daystar's audience was not the performative outrage that social media so often generates and so quickly forgets. It was something quieter, heavier, more considered, and in many ways far more consequential. On the Facebook groups and online communities where Daystar viewers had gathered for years, sharing prayer requests, testimonies, encouragement, and the ordinary texture of lives lived in common faith, the tone shifted within hours of the announcement. Long-time donors began to write, not in anger exactly, but in something closer to sorrow compounded by disbelief. Men and women who had given to Daystar for 20, 25, 30 years. Who had stretched their fixed incomes during pledge drives because they believed in what the network represented. They asked publicly and without apology how the decision had been made, who had been consulted, and what it communicated about the values of the institution now carrying Joni Lamb's name and legacy. The questions were not rhetorical. They were the genuine inquiries of people who had invested deeply, and who felt entitled, by virtue of that investment, to an accounting that was not forthcoming. What emerged organically from those conversations was something that participants themselves began calling a silent boycott. No single organizer. No coordinated campaign. No hashtag engineered by a communications team. Just individual believers in their own voices on their own pages, making their own decisions and then sharing those decisions with the communities they had built over years of digital fellowship. They would not attend the memorial service in person. They would not watch the broadcast. They would redirect their donations toward other ministries whose institutional associations did not carry the weight of what Gateway now carried.